The sun over the Arizona Territory in the year 1870 was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, a branding iron that baked the cracked earth until it split open like a beggar's palm. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything: the sagebrush, the skeletal ribs of saguaro cacti, and the rickety wagon that groaned its way toward the town of Redemption. The dust settled in the folds of Clara's dress, a plain gray garment that was already worn thin from a life that had offered little more than friction. At 19 years of age, she felt as ancient as the mountains that shimmered, distant and indifferent, on the horizon. She sat on the hard plank of the wagon seat, her hands clenched in her lap, her spine a rigid line of defiance against the jolting of the wheels. Beside her, the traitor, a man named Silas, chewed on a stick of licorice, the sweet, cloying scent mixing with the sweat of the mules and the ever-present dust. He had not spoken more than 100 words to her in the week since he had collected her. There was no need. The transaction had been settled long before. She was cargo, a mail-order bride purchased and paid for, now being delivered to a man she had never met. Mr. Darren Poe. The name felt like a stone in her mouth. His letters, written in a cramped, forceful hand, had spoken of protection, of a respectable life, of a home. For a girl with nothing, they were words that glittered like fool's gold in a pan of dirty water. But Clara knew better than to trust the gleam of things. Life had taught her that lesson in the cruelest of classrooms. Her mind, a place she tried to keep locked and barred, drifted back against her will. She saw the faces of her parents, faded like old photographs, gone to a fever when she was just a child. Then came the orphanage, a place of cold floors and thinner soup. And after that, the city. A woman with a painted smile had promised her work, a warm bed, and good food. The bed had been warm, yes, but it had never been hers alone. She had been trapped in a gilded cage, a house where men paid for the illusion of affection, and she was forced to learn a trade that hollowed her out from the inside, leaving nothing but a shell of shame. She had escaped one moonless night, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a resolve to never again be owned. Yet here she was, sold once more, trading one cage for another in the desperate hope that this one might have a window. The silent grief was a constant companion, a weight in her chest that made each breath feel heavy. She mourned the girl she might have been, the one who could have met a man with a blush and a shy smile, not with a silent, screaming terror that she fought to keep hidden behind her carefully blank expression. "Almost there," Silas grunted, spitting a brown stream of licorice juice into the dust. "That's Redemption." Ahead, a handful of wooden buildings shimmered in the heat, huddled together as if for comfort against the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the plains. It looked less like a town and more like a collection of driftwood washed ashore in a sea of dirt. As the wagon rattled down the main street, which was little more than a wide, rutted track, doors opened and faces appeared in windows. Eyes followed their progress, cold and curious. Clara felt their stares like tiny pinpricks on her skin. She kept her gaze fixed on her own hands, but she could hear the whispers, carried on the dry breeze like thistle seeds. They were not welcoming words. They were assessments, judgments passed by people who knew nothing of her but had already decided everything. "That's Poe's bride." "Heard she came from the city." "Look at her. Got that look about her." Then, the two words that had followed her since she had fled that terrible house. The brand she feared was burned upon her very soul. Not pure. The whisper was sharp, venomous, spoken by a woman in a calico dress standing outside the general store. The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Her shoulders slumped, the rigid line of her spine finally breaking. It was the truth, or at least their truth, and it was a truth she could never outrun. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the largest building in town, a 2-story ranch house that seemed to glower down at the rest of the settlement. It was freshly painted, a stark white that hurt the eyes in the afternoon sun. A man stood on the porch, his shadow long and sharp in the waning light. He was older than Clara had imagined from his letters, perhaps in his 50s, with a thick neck and a prosperous belly that strained the buttons of his vest. His hair was slicked back with pomade, and his face was clean-shaven, a rarity in this part of the country. He did not smile. His eyes, small and dark, moved over her slowly, from the top of her dusty bonnet down to the tips of her worn boots. It was the look of a man appraising livestock. "Mr. Poe," Silas said, tipping his hat. "Delivery made, as promised." "Get her down," Darren Poe commanded, his voice a low rumble. Silas nudged Clara, and she slid clumsily from the wagon seat, her legs stiff from the long journey. She stood in the dirt before her future husband, feeling small and exposed. He descended the porch steps with a heavy, deliberate tread, stopping just before her. He smelled of soap and whiskey. "So, you are Clara," he said. It was not a question. He reached out and took her chin in his hand, his grip surprisingly strong, forcing her to meet his gaze. She flinched but held her ground. His eyes searched her face, not for beauty or for spirit, but for flaws. "You will do. A bit scrawny, but some good meals will fix that. You are clean." The question hung in the air, thick and ugly. Clara's throat went dry. She could only nod. A tiny, jerky movement. The shame burned in her cheeks. "Good," he said, releasing her. He turned to Silas and passed him a small pouch of coins. "Our business is concluded." Silas nodded, eager to be gone. He turned the wagon around without another word to Clara and headed back the way he had come, leaving her alone with this stranger and the watchful, judging eyes of the town. "Come inside," Poe ordered, turning his back on her and walking up the steps. "The women will get you cleaned up. The wedding is tomorrow." Clara's heart seized. "Tomorrow?" The word was a choked whisper. Poe paused at the door and looked back at her over his shoulder. His expression was one of mild irritation, as if she were a dim-witted child. "There is no sense in delaying. A woman like you should be grateful to be married at all. You are lucky I was willing to take you. A fresh start. I am giving you my name, my protection. Do not forget it." He did not wait for a reply. He disappeared into the shadows of the house, leaving the door open. Clara stood frozen for a moment, the dust swirling around her ankles. He was right. She was lucky. That is what she was supposed to believe. But the protection he offered felt like a locked room, and his name felt like a collar. With a deep, shuddering breath, she picked up her small, battered satchel and walked into the house that was to be her home and her prison. The night was as cold as the day had been hot. A sliver of moon offered little light, and the stars were scattered across the black sky like chips of ice. Clara sat on the edge of a bed in a small, sparse room upstairs. Two women from the town, their faces grim and disapproving, had brought her a bucket of water and a rough bar of soap. They had watched her bathe as if expecting the dirt of her past to leave a stain in the tub. They had given her a simple white nightgown and left without a word. Now she was alone, staring out the window at the dark plains. Escape. The thought was a wild bird beating its wings against the cage of her ribs. She could slip out the door, run into the night, but where would she go? The desert was a killer, and the towns were filled with people who would see the same stain on her that the people of redemption saw. There was nowhere to run where she could escape herself. She was trapped, not by the walls of this house, but by the geography of her own life. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window pane and let a single, hot tear trace a path through the grime on her cheek. She must have dozed off, slumped in the chair, because she woke to a strange orange light flickering against the walls and the smell of wood smoke, sharp and acrid. At first, she thought it was the fireplace downstairs, but the light was growing brighter, and now she could hear shouting from outside. A raw, primal fear seized her. She ran to the door and pulled it open. The hallway was thick with billowing smoke that stung her eyes and clawed at her throat. The heat was immense. Below, the staircase was engulfed in a roaring wall of orange and yellow. The fire was in the house. Panic constricted her chest. She slammed the door shut and stumbled back to the window, coughing, her lungs burning. Down below, in the street, a crowd had gathered. Figures were silhouetted against the inferno that was now consuming the barn next to the house, its flames leaping high into the night sky. She could see them pointing, shouting, their faces illuminated by the terrifying light, but no one was moving toward the house. No one was coming to help. They were just watching her burn. The fire must have been started in the barn. Perhaps it was arson, or perhaps a lantern had been knocked over by one of Poe's drunken ranch hands. It did not matter. The flames had found the dry wood of the main house and were devouring it with a hungry roar. Clara banged on the window, her voice a useless, choked cry. The glass was hot to the touch. The floorboards beneath her feet were growing warm. The smoke was so thick now she could barely see across the room. She was going to die here, alone, judged, and forgotten. Just as the last of her hope began to dissolve into terror, a new figure appeared on the edge of the chaos. A man on a tall, dark horse, a pack mule trailing behind him. He was just riding into town, a stranger passing through. He pulled his horse to a halt, his silhouette stark against the raging fire. He took in the scene for only a second. The burning house, the trapped woman in the window, the crowd of spectators. Then, without hesitation, he swung down from his saddle. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth and moved toward the house with a long, determined stride that was the complete opposite of the crowd's frozen inertia. He did not shout or ask questions. He simply acted. People parted before him, their murmurs turning to gasps of shock. He ran onto the porch, kicking open the front door, and disappeared into the churning vortex of smoke and flame. Inside, Clara had collapsed to the floor. Overcome by the smoke, the world was fading to black, the roar of the fire a distant hum in her ears. Through the haze, a shape emerged, a man moving through the hellish heat as if the fire itself was wary of him. He found her on the floor, a small, white shape in the suffocating darkness. Strong arms scooped her up. It happened so fast, she had no time to process it. One moment she was on the floor waiting for death. The next, she was being lifted, held tight against a solid chest. Her head lolled back, and she got a glimpse of his face through the smoke, eyes that were startlingly clear and calm amidst the madness, a jaw set with grim purpose. He moved with a speed and confidence that defied the collapsing structure around them. He carried her as if she weighed nothing at all. He burst back out onto the porch just as a section of the roof caved in with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks into the night. He did not slow, carrying her clear of the house and out into the street, away from the heat and the smoke. He finally stopped a safe distance away, the cool night air a shocking balm on her scorched skin. He gently lowered her to the ground, steadying her as her legs threatened to buckle. She coughed. Great. Heaving racks that brought tears to her eyes. Her nightgown was singed, her face and arms blackened with soot. The townspeople stared, their mouths agape, their judgment momentarily forgotten in the face of such raw, immediate action. Clara looked up at the man who had saved her. He was tall and lean, dressed in dusty trail clothes. His face was weathered by the sun and wind, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a startling kindness. He was a stranger. He knew nothing of her. He had risked his life for her. The shame, the fear, and the lifetime of feeling worthless washed over her in a dizzying wave. She swayed on her feet, and her voice, when it came out, was a broken, ragged whisper, the only words she could find to explain the horrible truth of herself. "I'm not pure." The man looked down at her. The firelight danced in his eyes, reflecting the flames of the house she had escaped. His expression did not change. There was no shock, no pity, no disgust. There was only a quiet, unshakable certainty. He knelt slightly to meet her gaze, his voice low and steady, cutting through the crackle of the fire and the murmurs of the crowd. "That's not why I saved you." The first thing Clara was aware of was the silence. It was a deep, profound quiet, broken only by the gentle crackle of a nearby fire. The air did not smell of smoke and ash, but of pine, dust, and something savory, like coffee. She was lying on a narrow cot, covered by a rough but clean wool blanket. Her body ached, and her skin felt tight and tender in places. But she was alive. She opened her eyes slowly. The ceiling was made of rough-hewn logs. The gaps chinked with dried mud. She turned her head, wincing at the pull of a burn on her shoulder. She was in a small, one-room cabin. The furniture was sparse and handmade. A sturdy table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace where a low fire danced, and a few shelves holding tins and sacks of flour. It was a place built for survival, not for comfort. Yet, in that moment, it felt like the safest place on earth. The man from the fire was sitting at the table, his back to her, carefully cleaning a rifle. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted motions. He seemed to be a part of the cabin's Spartan stillness. Hearing the rustle of the blanket, he set the rifle down and turned. His eyes, the same calm, clear eyes she remembered from the inferno, met hers. "You're awake," he said. His voice was low and even, like the rumble of distant thunder. "Thirsty?" Clara could only nod, her throat raw and scratchy. He stood and walked to the fireplace, pouring water from a kettle into a tin cup. He brought it to her, and she struggled to sit up. He held the cup for her, his large, calloused hand steady as she sipped the warm water. It soothed the fire in her throat. "My name is Eli," he said, taking the empty cup. "You have some burns. I put some salve on them." She looked down at her arms. Patches of her skin were an angry red, but they had been cleaned and covered with a thick, herbal-smelling ointment. He had tended to her wounds while she slept. A stranger. He had done this for her. The thought was so foreign, so contrary to everything she had ever known, that it made her feel dizzy. He had not asked for payment. He had not made a demand. He had simply helped. He saw the confusion and fear in her eyes. "You're safe here," he said again, as if understanding that was the only thing that mattered. He did not ask her name. He did not ask what had happened, or why a young woman was alone in a burning house in the middle of the night. He simply accepted her presence as a fact, like the wind or the sun. For the next 2 days, they barely spoke. Clara's body healed, the angry redness of her burns fading to a dull pink. Her voice, however, remained trapped in her throat. Eli moved around her with a quiet consideration she found both comforting and unnerving. He would leave food and water by her cot, then retreat to the other side of the room to mend a harness or sharpen a knife, giving her space. He slept on a bedroll by the fire, never once looking at her in a way that made her feel exposed. On the 3rd morning, as she watched him stoke the fire, a sudden, vivid memory flashed through his mind, unbidden. It was not of the war, not of the blood and the noise, but of a different fire, a gentle one in a hearth much like this one. A woman's laughter, light and easy. Sarah. Her hair had caught the firelight just so, turning it the color of spun gold. And a small boy, no more than 4, with his mother's eyes, asleep in his lap. Jacob. The memory was so sharp, it was like a knife in his gut. Then came the other memory, the one that always followed, the oppressive heat of a sick room, the metallic smell of cholera, the chilling silence of a house that had once been filled with life. He had been away, scouting for the army. And when he returned, he had found only graves. He pushed the memory down, locking it away in the scarred and empty place where he kept his heart. When he turned back to the room, his face was a mask of calm, but the sorrow was a ghost in his eyes. Clara saw it. that flicker of profound loss. She recognized it because she carried a similar ghost inside herself. She felt a strange kinship with this silent man, a shared understanding of grief that needed no words, and that terrified her. Kindness was a currency she did not possess, a language she did not speak. She could not stay here, a burden in the house of a good man who had already known too much sorrow. She had to leave. While he was outside tending to his horse, she swung her legs off the cot. Her muscles protested, but she pushed through the pain. The singed nightgown was all she had. She had to go now, before he returned, before he could see the worthless creature he had saved. She took a deep, shaky breath and took a step toward the door. It was not locked. She knew it would not be. She had her hand on the rough wooden handle when he spoke from behind her. "You can stay as long as you need." She froze, her back to him. She had not heard him come in. He was as quiet as a shadow. "I cannot," she whispered, the words tearing at her raw throat. I have nothing." "I ain't asking for nothing," he replied, his voice still even, without a trace of pity or judgment. "There is food, a roof. It is not much, but it is yours if you need it." She turned slowly to face him. He stood by the table, making no move toward her, leaving the choice entirely hers. The sincerity in his eyes was a thing of such simple, devastating power that it undid her. She had spent her life being told her worth was in what she could provide, what could be taken from her. This man was offering her shelter for no other reason than that she needed it. The unworthiness she felt was a poison, and his kindness was the antidote she did not believe she deserved. Her resolve crumbled. She let her hand fall from the door and stumbled back to the cot, defeated by a generosity she could not comprehend. From that day on, a fragile rhythm began to form between them. Clara, unable to sit idle, began to help. She started small, sweeping the dirt floor with a broom made of bundled twigs. Then she straightened his blankets, washed the few dishes he owned. He had a few changes of clothes, worn and patched. She found a needle and thread in a small wooden box and began to mend them, her stitches small and neat. Her mother had taught her to sew, a lifetime ago. In a world that no longer existed, the simple, repetitive motion of the needle was calming, a small act of creation in a life that had been filled with destruction. Eli accepted her help without comment, but she would find a fresh bucket of water waiting for her in the morning, or a piece of jerky left on the table for her midday meal. One day, he brought in a bolt of blue calico cloth from his pack mule. He set it on the table without a word. It was a silent offering, a recognition that she needed a dress. For the first time in a very long time, Clara felt a flicker of something other than fear or shame. It was a tentative, fragile thing, like the first green shoot pushing its way through frozen ground. She made the dress slowly, carefully, and when it was done, she put it on and felt, for the first time in years, like a person again. Not just a collection of scars and regrets. The nights were the quietest. They would sit on opposite sides of the hearth, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The heat from the flames warmed the small space between them. It was not a heat of passion, but of presence, a shared solitude. He would clean his gear or carve small figures from scraps of wood. She would watch the flames, her mind blessedly empty for long stretches. In these quiet moments, she began to feel something she had never known before: safety. Eli never moved too quickly, never spoke too loudly. He never, ever touched her. If he needed to pass her something, he would set it down for her to pick up. He kept a respectful distance, creating an invisible boundary around her that no one had ever honored before. He was giving her back the ownership of her own body, one silent evening at a time. For the first time, she could breathe without feeling like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to reveal its price. But the ghosts of her past were not so easily banished. Sometimes, a certain angle of the firelight would remind her of the gas lamps in the brothel, and the smell of stale perfume and desperation would fill her senses. She would remember the cruel, assessing eyes of the Madame Eve, who had taught her that a woman's body was a commodity to be bought and sold. She would feel the phantom weight of Poe's hand on her chin, his possessive gaze that stripped her bare. The shame would rise up in her, hot and suffocating, and she would have to clench her fists to keep from crying out. She was damaged goods. The townspeople had been right. What was she doing here, tainting this quiet man's home with her filth? About a week after the fire, Eli rode into Redemption for supplies. He was gone most of the day. Clara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach with each passing hour. She tended to his horse, a big, steady gelding named Boulder, feeding him and brushing his coat until it shone. The simple, physical work helped to keep the fear at bay. When Eli returned just before dusk, his face was grim. He unpacked the supplies silently, setting a sack of flour and a tin of coffee on the table. "Poe is alive," he said, his back still to her. "The roof of the porch collapsed on him, but he was pulled out. His arm is broken, and he has some burns, but he is alive." Clara's blood ran cold. She felt the fragile shell of safety she had built around herself crack. "He is telling everyone you set the fire to try and kill him," Eli continued, his voice low and hard. "He says you are his property, and that he will find you. He has offered a reward." Clara sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. He was hunting for her. The cage she had escaped was being rebuilt, its bars stronger than ever. The next afternoon, a visitor came to the cabin. It was the town preacher, a thin, severe man named Reverend Miller. He rode up on a sway-backed mule, his Bible clutched in one hand like a weapon. Eli met him outside, standing in front of the cabin door as if to block the way. Clara watched from the single window, her heart pounding. "Brother," the preacher began, his voice sanctimonious, "the town is in an uproar. You are harboring a fugitive, a woman of ill repute who belongs to another man." "She belongs to no one," Eli said, his voice flat and cold. "The law of God and the law of man say otherwise," the preacher insisted. "She is Mr. Poe's intended. You are inviting sin and violence into your home. He is a powerful man in these parts. He will not let this go. For your own soul and for your own safety, you must turn her over." Eli took a slow step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat, but there was a look in his eyes, a stillness that was more menacing than any shout. "This is my land. You are not welcome here. Leave." The preacher, taken aback by Eli's quiet intensity, stammered for a moment, then turned his mule and rode away, casting a final, damning look back at the small cabin. That night, the dam inside Clara finally broke. As she sat by the fire, the preacher's words echoed in her mind. A woman of ill repute, the shame was a physical thing, a sickness that churned in her stomach. She began to tremble, a small, quiet shudder that grew until her whole body was shaking. A low sob escaped her lips, then another, and another, until she was weeping. The silent, desperate tears of a lifetime of pain. Eli moved from his place across the hearth. He knelt before her, and for the first time, he reached out and touched her, his hand gently settling on her shaking shoulder. The touch was not possessive or demanding. It was an anchor, a steady, solid presence in the storm that was tearing her apart. He said nothing. He just knelt there, his hand on her shoulder, letting her cry until there were no tears left. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and soot from the fire that still seemed to cling to her. Her voice was a raw, broken whisper. The same words she had spoken on the night he saved her, but this time they were filled with a confession of all the ugly things she believed herself to be. "You don't know what I've done." Eli looked at her, his face full of a deep, sorrowful understanding that went beyond her words. He had seen the horrors of war, the casual cruelty of men, the indiscriminate brutality of disease. He knew that the world was full of actions that left scars on the soul. His gaze did not waver. "You don't know what I've done either." The night of Clara's breakdown was a turning point, a flood that washed away the debris of silence between them. In its wake, something new and fragile began to grow. The trust she placed in Eli, a tiny, precarious seed, started to send out roots, but it was a different kind of trust, one she had to learn to place in herself, that truly began to change the landscape of her world. It began a few days later. In the white-hot light of midday, Eli took a heavy Colt revolver from a locked wooden box and laid it on the table. Clara stared at it. It was a cold, ugly thing, a tool of violence and death. "Every soul in this territory should know how to use one of these," he said, his voice practical, devoid of drama. "Not to seek out trouble, but to end it if it finds you." Her first instinct was to shrink back. The only hands she had seen holding guns were cruel ones. But then she thought of Poe, of the leering faces in the brothel, of her own helplessness in the fire. She thought of the fear, that constant, sickening companion. She straightened her shoulders and nodded. He took her to a wide, flat clearing behind the cabin, the canyon walls rising up on either side. He was a patient teacher. He showed her how to hold the gun, how to brace her arm, how the weight of it should feel like an extension of her own will. The first time she pulled the trigger, the explosion was a physical shock, a brutal clap of thunder that slammed her shoulder back and sent a jolt up her arm. The shot went wide, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet from the tin can he had set on a rock. Her ears rang, and her hand trembled. "Again," he said calmly. And so she did, again and again. She fired until her shoulder ached and her hand was numb. Slowly, her fear of the weapon was replaced by a grudging respect for it. She learned to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it, to align the sight with a steady eye. With each shot that landed closer to the target, she felt a small, hard kernel of confidence forming inside her. This was not the passive endurance she had always known. This was power, tangible and real. The change was not just in her hands. It began to show in her eyes. The following week, when they needed flour and salt, Eli looked at her. "I will ride with you," he said. "No," she replied, the word coming out stronger than she expected. "I will go alone." He studied her face for a long moment, then simply nodded. The ride into redemption was a trial by fire. She kept her head high, her back straight in the saddle of the pack mule. The whispers still followed her. The stares still pricked at her skin. But this time, she did not lower her gaze to her hands. She met their eyes, one by one. She saw their judgment, their suspicion, their scorn. But she did not flinch. She held the memory of the Colt's weight in her hand, and it gave her a strange, cold courage. She was no longer just the damaged girl who had been sold to Darren Poe. She was the woman who had survived the fire. In the general store, a woman with a face like a dried apple sneered at her as she paid for her goods. "Some folks have no shame, taking up with a strange man after nearly burning our town to the ground." Before Clara could even form a reply, another woman stepped forward. She was older, with kind, crinkled eyes and hands dusted with flour. "And some folks have no charity. Martha, the girl needed help. Eli gave it. That is a Christian act. Last I checked my Bible." She turned her warm gaze to Clara. "I am Ruth. My husband passed a few years back. It is a hard life out here alone." The words were simple, but they were a lifeline. It was the first time anyone in this town, anyone in years, had offered her friendship without a price attached. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice quiet but steady. "I am Clara." Ruth just smiled, a small, genuine gesture that warmed Clara more than the afternoon sun. On the ride back to the canyon, Clara felt a lightness in her chest. She had faced the town, and she had found an ally. Eli began to teach her other things, the quiet language of the land. He showed her how to read the tracks of a coyote in the dust, how to tell the time of day by the angle of the sun and the length of the shadows. He taught her which plants were good for medicine and which were poison, how to find water by following the line of cottonwood trees in a dry wash. He showed her how to listen to the wind, how it whispered of coming rain when it blew from the east, how it carried the scent of dust and distance when it came from the west. She was a quick study, absorbing the knowledge with a quiet intensity. This was a different kind of power than the gun offered. It was the power of belonging, of understanding the world around her, of knowing she could survive in it. They began to take long rides together, not for supplies, but simply to ride. They explored the winding canyons, their horses' hooves echoing off the towering red rock walls. They climbed to the top of mesas that overlooked the vast, sprawling desert, a patchwork of sagebrush and sand that stretched to the end of the world. In these moments, with the sun on her face and the wind whipping her hair free from its tight bun, Clara felt a sense of freedom she had never imagined. She would watch Eli as he rode ahead, his silhouette lean and capable against the enormous sky. He was as much a part of this landscape as the rocks and the sun, and she was beginning to feel that she could be, too. One night, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The wind began to howl, and a torrential rainstorm swept across the plains. In the middle of the deluge, there was a frantic pounding on the cabin door. It was a young homesteader named Thomas, from a small spread a few miles down the canyon. His face was pale with panic. "It is my wife, Mary," he gasped, water streaming from his hat. "The baby is coming. It is too soon, and the midwife is in town. I cannot get there in this storm." Eli looked at Clara. There was no one else. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew nothing of childbirth, only the ugly, transactional side of what happened between men and women. But she saw the terror in the young man's eyes, and she thought of the woman, alone and in pain. "I will help," she said, her voice firm. They rode through the storm, the rain lashing at them. The homesteader's cabin was tiny, the single room lit by a flickering lantern. Mary was on the bed, her face contorted in pain. Clara took a deep breath and pushed aside her fear. She sent Thomas to boil water and tear strips of clean linen. She sat by Mary's side, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice. She remembered the things Ruth had told her, snippets of womanly wisdom picked up in the general store. She held Mary's hand, and in the grip of this other woman, she found a strength she did not know she possessed. The night was long and filled with struggle, but as the storm began to break and the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, a new sound filled the small cabin, the thin, wailing cry of a healthy baby boy. Clara cleaned the infant, wrapped him in a soft cloth, and placed him in his mother's arms. Mary wept with relief and joy, her eyes shining with gratitude as she looked at Clara. When they finally returned to their own cabin, exhausted and soaked to the bone, the sun was rising, washing the desert in hues of pink and gold. Eli had been silent for the entire ride back. As Clara slid down from her horse, he stood watching her. There was an expression on his face she had never seen before, a look of raw, undisguised awe. In the golden light of the new day, he did not see a broken girl with a shameful past. He saw a woman who radiated a quiet, fierce strength, a woman who could bring life and comfort into a world of pain. He stepped forward and gently brushed a stray, damp strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was electric, a spark that ignited the slow-burning heat that had been building between them for weeks. She looked up at him, her heart doing a slow, heavy tumble in her chest. The air was thick with unspoken things. He lowered his head, his gaze searching her eyes, asking a silent question. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or demand, but one of hesitant wonder. It was gentle, questioning, as if he were afraid she might break. His lips were chapped from the wind, but warm. She felt a lifetime of tension release from her shoulders, and she leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. The kiss deepened, becoming something real and solid, a promise spoken in a language older than words. For the first time, Clara was not taking what was offered out of desperation. She was choosing. She let herself fall into his arms, and he held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Later that evening, sitting by the fire, the comfortable silence between them had a new quality, a new depth. "I have never had a real wedding," Clara confessed into the quiet, her voice barely a whisper. "Only promises traded in a dark room, contracts of desperation." Eli listened, his expression unchanging. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object he had been carving for days. It was a ring, fashioned from a piece of smooth, polished bone, as white as the moon. He had etched a delicate, swirling pattern into it, like the wind. He held it out to her on the palm of his hand. It was not a proposal. It was an offering. "I ask nothing of you, Clara," he said, his voice low and serious. "Not a promise, not a vow, only that you stay because you want to, and that you wear this, if you want to remember that you are not bound to anyone, not even to me." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the simple, beautiful ring. It was more precious than any diamond, because it was a symbol not of ownership, but of freedom. She took it from his palm and slid it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The peace, however, was short-lived. A few days later, Ruth sought Clara out at the edge of town when she rode in for supplies. The widow's face was etched with worry. "Be careful, Clara," she warned in a low voice. "Two of Poe's men were at the trading post yesterday. They were armed, and they were asking about you. They said Poe is healing, and his temper is getting fouler by the day. He wants what he paid for." The familiar cold dread washed over Clara, but this time it was followed by a flash of anger, hot and clean. She had been running her whole life, from the orphanage, from the brothel, from Poe. She was tired of running. This small cabin, this quiet man, this piece of bone on her finger, this was her life now. She would not let it be taken from her. When she told Eli that night, his face hardened. His hand went instinctively to the pistol he wore on his hip. "I will handle it. You will stay here, where you are safe." "No," Clara said, standing up to face him. The firelight cast her shadow long and defiant on the cabin wall. "He is not hunting you, Eli. He is hunting me. I have been running my whole life, letting other people decide who I am, what I am worth. If I hide behind you now, I will always be that girl, trapped in the burning house." He started to protest, his protective instincts warring with the respect he had for her, but she cut him off, her voice ringing with a clarity and conviction that stunned them both. "If I do not stand and face him myself, I will never truly belong to myself." The next morning, they rode out of the canyon not at a gallop, but with a slow, deliberate pace. They did not speak. The decision had been made, and words felt small and unnecessary against the vast, silent backdrop of the desert. When they reached the edge of redemption, Eli reined in his horse. He dismounted, then turned and offered his hand to Clara. She took it, sliding down from her own mount. He tied the reins to a hitching post, and then he looked at her, a question in his eyes. She answered by squaring her shoulders and lifting her chin. He nodded, and his fingers intertwined with hers. Hand in hand, they walked down the main street. A hush fell over the town. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer ceased. The boisterous noise from the saloon died down. A woman shaking a rug on a balcony froze, her hands stilled in midair. Doors creaked open, and faces appeared in windows. They were met with a wave of silent, collective judgment. The air was thick with it, a suffocating blanket of scorn and curiosity. The townsfolk stared at their joined hands, a public declaration that defied every ugly whisper that had been passed about her. Clara felt the familiar burn of shame rise in her cheeks, but she fought it down. She focused on the feel of Eli's hand, his calloused palm a warm, solid anchor in the sea of hostile eyes. She drew strength from it, but she also drew strength from the hard-won ground beneath her own feet. She was not the frightened girl who had arrived in a trader's wagon. She kept her head high, her gaze fixed forward, refusing to shrink under their scrutiny. She was walking toward her fear, not away from it, and with every step, she felt a little more of herself coming home. Their destination was the saloon. It was where the men of the town gathered, where Poe would be nursing his whiskey and his rage. Pushing through the swinging doors was like entering another world, a dim, smoky cave that smelled of stale beer, sweat, and unfulfilled promises. The room was crowded, but it fell silent as they entered. Every man at the bar, every player at the poker tables, turned to stare. And there he was. Darren Poe sat at a table in the corner, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. His left arm was in a dirty sling, and a puckered, angry burn scar twisted the side of his face, pulling one corner of his mouth into a permanent sneer. His eyes, small and black, landed on Clara, and they lit with a triumphant, venomous fire. He had been waiting for this. He shoved his chair back and rose unsteadily to his feet, a drunken caricature of authority. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice slurring but loud enough to fill the silent room. "Look what the wind blew in, my runaway bride, holding hands with the horse thief who stole her." Eli's hand tightened on hers, his body tensing, but he remained silent, letting this be her stage. "I am no one's bride, Mr. Poe," Clara said. Her voice did not tremble. It was as calm and clear as a bell, cutting through the thick, smoky air. Poe let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You are what I paid for. A contract is a contract." He took a staggering step forward, his eyes roaming over her with a look of such naked contempt that it made her skin crawl. "Or did you forget what you are? Did you think a few weeks in the desert with him would wash you clean?" He leaned forward, spitting the words at her, wanting every man in that room to hear, wanting to brand her with his final, ugliest truth. "You are a whore, a soiled dove from the city, and you will always be a whore." The word hung in the air, vile and heavy. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, but she did not back down. She looked past Poe's twisted face, past the curious and condemning eyes of the men in the room, and she saw the long, dark road of her past. She saw the frightened orphan, the trapped girl in the gilded cage, the woman in the burning house. She had been all of those things, but they were not all of her. She let go of Eli's hand and took a single step forward, claiming the space as her own. She looked Darren Poe directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "I was never yours," she said, her voice low and firm, imbued with a power that came from a place deeper than anger. "I was never anyone's." For a moment, Poe was stunned into silence. He had expected tears, fear, submission. He had not expected this quiet, unbreakable dignity. Her refusal to be broken, her refusal to accept his definition of her, enraged him more than anything else. His face contorted with drunken fury. "If I cannot have you, then no one will," he snarled, and his rage shifted its focus. He turned on Eli. "And as for you, you will pay for touching my property." Before Eli could react, Poe lunged, his good arm swinging a wild, clumsy punch. The fight was not a duel of honor. It was a brutal, desperate brawl. They crashed out of the saloon, stumbling through the swinging doors and into the dusty street. The crowd followed, spilling out onto the boardwalks to watch the spectacle. Poe was fueled by whiskey and hate, but Eli was stronger and faster. He moved with the deadly grace of a man who had seen real combat, dodging and blocking, his face a grim mask of control, but he would not draw his weapon. Poe was a drunken rancher, not a soldier on a battlefield, and Eli's past had left him with a deep-seated hatred of killing. He would defend himself, but he would not kill for this. This refusal gave Poe an advantage. He fought with a wild, animalistic ferocity, kicking and gouging. He landed a heavy blow to Eli's ribs, and Clara heard the sickening crack from the boardwalk. Eli grunted in pain. Stumbling back, Poe pressed his advantage, his fists flying, catching Eli on the jaw with a powerful right hook. Eli went down, his head hitting the hard-packed dirt with a thud. Poe stood over him, panting, a triumphant, ugly look on his scarred face. He drew back his boot to kick the downed man. Something inside Clara snapped. The fear, the shame, the helplessness, it all burned away, leaving behind a cold, clear certainty. She moved without thinking. She reached down and drew the Colt from the holster on Eli's hip. The weight of it was familiar now, steadying. She did not point it at Poe. She raised it to the sky. Her hands, to her own astonishment, were perfectly steady. She pulled the trigger. The gunshot was a deafening crack that echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. It shocked the brawl to an immediate halt. Every head turned to her. Poe froze, his boot still raised, his eyes wide with disbelief. Clara stood on the boardwalk, the smoking pistol held firmly in her hand. She was no longer a victim. She was a reckoning. "That is enough," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority no one in that town had ever heard from her. She lowered the gun, not aiming it but holding it as a clear statement of intent. She looked directly at Poe, her eyes as hard and unyielding as desert rock. "You will leave this town. You will leave this territory. You will never show your face here again. If you do, you will not be dealing with him." She gestured with the gun toward the injured Eli. "You will be dealing with the law. You will face justice for what you have done." A stunned silence held the street captive. Then, a new voice broke the quiet. "She is right. Darren—" Ruth stepped off the boardwalk, her kind face set in a determined line. She walked into the street and stood near Clara, a small, unassuming woman making a monumental stand. "You have hounded this poor girl enough. It is you who bring shame to this town, not her." Another man, the blacksmith, stepped forward. "Leave them be. Poe!" Then a woman, then another man, a small but determined faction of the town, shamed into decency by the courage of a woman they had once scorned, began to close the circle. Their faces turned not against Clara, but against her tormentor. Poe looked from face to face, his drunken fury dissolving into bewildered humiliation. He had lost. He had not been beaten by a gunslinger, but by the quiet dignity of the woman he had tried to destroy, with a final, hateful glare. He spat in the dust, turned, and limped away toward his horse, a defeated man retreating from a battle he had never understood. Clara did not watch him go. She dropped the gun and rushed to Eli's side, kneeling in the dirt. He was a mess of blood and dust. His lip was split. One eye was already swelling shut, and every breath he took was a shallow, painful gasp. He tried to sit up, but fell back with a groan. With the help of the blacksmith, she got him to his feet and slowly, painfully, they made their way back to the cabin in the canyon. She spent the rest of the day tending to him. She cleaned his cuts, her touch as gentle as a whisper. She washed the blood from his face. She wrapped his ribs tightly with strips of linen, her movements careful and sure. He lay on the cot, his eyes closed for much of the time, drifting in a haze of pain. When he was settled, she sat in the chair beside him, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, her heart a tight, aching knot of fear and a fierce, unfamiliar pride. As evening fell and the cabin filled with the soft glow of the fire, he opened his eyes. He looked at her, and a weak, lopsided smile touched his battered lips. "You saved me this time," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Tears sprang to her eyes, tears of relief and a love so profound it felt like it might break her open. All the walls she had built around her heart, all the defenses she had learned in a lifetime of pain, crumbled to dust. The raw, Terrifying emotions of the day, the fear, the rage, the triumphant relief, all coalesced into a single, overwhelming need. A need to be close to him, to feel his life against hers, to affirm in the most fundamental way that they were both still alive. She stood up and began to unbutton the simple calico dress she wore. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the sheer, earth-shattering gravity of her own choice. The dress slid from her shoulders and pooled at her feet, leaving her standing in her thin chemise in the flickering firelight. He watched her, his eyes wide, his painful breathing the only sound in the room. She walked to the cot and knelt beside him. She looked into his eyes, wanting him to see everything in hers, the scars of her past, the strength of her present, the hope for her future. "I choose this," she whispered, the words a sacred vow. He reached up with his good hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was reverent. A tear slid from the corner of his swollen eye, tracing a path through the dust and blood on his cheek. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with an emotion that stripped him bare. "I saved you for this night, Clara," he said, his words a painful, beautiful confession. "Not to take, not to own, but to finally give you back what was stolen." He moved over on the narrow cot, making room for her, with infinite slowness. She lay down beside him, her body a fragile, trembling question mark against his. He did not pull her closer, did not make a single demand. He waited. He gave her the space to make the final choice. And she did. She moved toward him, her arm sliding around his chest, careful of his broken ribs. She pressed her face into the curve of his neck, breathing in the scent of him, of dust and leather and honest sweat. It was the scent of safety, of home. By the warm, gentle light of the fire, their bodies met. It was not a collision of passion, but a slow, tender discovery. Every touch was a question, every caress an answer. It was vulnerable and beautiful, a quiet act of healing. For Clara, it was a baptism, a reclamation, in the arms of this kind, broken man, in the safety of this small, quiet cabin. She finally, completely, took back possession of herself. It was not the taking of a prize or the payment of a debt. It was a gift, freely given. And in that moment, she was not pure, she was not soiled, she was whole. The days that followed were a quiet testament to the shifting balance between them. Eli's recovery was slow and painful. The deep bruises on his face faded from a violent purple to a sickly yellow-green, and his cracked ribs made every breath a careful negotiation. He was confined to the cot for the better part of a week, a man of action forced into stillness, and a restless frustration simmered just beneath his calm exterior. During this time, Clara became the protector of their small homestead. The role reversal was a silent, unspoken thing. She rose before the sun, her movements sure and steady in the pre-dawn chill. The axe, which had once felt so foreign and heavy in her hands, now felt like a familiar tool. She learned the rhythm of it, the satisfying thud as the blade bit into dry pine, the sharp crack as the wood split. The growing stack of firewood beside the cabin was a visible measure of her work, a bulwark against the cold nights. She took Eli's rifle, the one he had taught her to use, and ventured into the scrubland. At first, she hunted small game, rabbits and squirrels, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration each time she pulled the trigger. But her aim, honed by Eli's patient instruction, was true. She learned to clean her kills with a practical efficiency, wasting nothing. She checked the traps Eli had set along the canyon rim, her hands growing calloused, her senses sharpening to the subtle signs of the wild. She did all of this with a quiet, focused intensity. This work was not a burden, it was a claiming. With every swing of the axe, with every steady aim of the rifle, she was taking ownership of her life, proving to herself that she was not a fragile thing to be sheltered, but a force capable of sustaining, of defending. Eli would watch her from the cabin door, his face a mixture of pain, pride, and a deep, abiding love. He saw the strength that had always been inside her, now blooming in the harsh desert sun. One afternoon, the steady rhythm of their life was interrupted by the sound of an approaching horse. Clara instinctively reached for the rifle she kept propped against the doorframe. Eli struggled to sit up, his hand moving to his empty hip. They relaxed only when they recognized the rider as the town sheriff, a man named Coffee. He was a tall, weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much trouble. He dismounted slowly and tipped his hat. "Ma'am, Eli." "Sheriff," Eli acknowledged, his voice raspy. "Came to let you know. Darren Poe has left town," Coffee said, getting straight to the point. "He and the 2 men who work for him rode out yesterday morning, headed east. From the looks of it." He paused, his gaze lingering on Eli's battered face. "There were a few folks who saw what happened in the street. They told me how it was, how she," he nodded at Clara, "put an end to it. You were within your rights." A small measure of relief washed over Clara, but it was quickly tempered by the sheriff's next words. "I do not think he is the kind of man to let a humiliation like that go," Coffee warned. "He has lost face, and a man like that is dangerous. He is gone for now, but I would not be surprised if he came back." The sheriff did not stay long. He accepted a cup of water, gave them a final, cautionary nod, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and unease in his wake. That night, the conversation by the fire was different. The threat was no longer an abstract fear. It had a name and a direction. "He will come back," Clara said. It was not a question. "Yes," Eli agreed. "This land," she said, looking around the small, warm cabin that had become her entire world. "This is your home, but he will see it as a place to hurt you, because of me." "This is our home, Clara," he corrected her gently. "And what is ours?" "We defend." He shifted, wincing as his ribs protested. "The law is a flimsy thing out here. A sheriff cannot be everywhere at once. A deed, a title, that is something more solid, something the law respects." He looked at her, his gaze direct and serious. "If we were married, this land would be yours as much as mine. If anything were to happen to me, Poe could not touch it. He could not touch you. The law would see you as my wife, not his property." Clara listened, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. He was speaking of practical things, of law and land and protection. But underneath the practical words, she heard the real question. He was offering her a fortress, not of his strength, but of their union. It was not a cage, but a foundation upon which they could build a life. "It would not be for appearances," she said softly, needing to be sure he understood. "Not for the town, not for anyone but us." "For no one but us," he confirmed. She looked at the simple bone ring on her finger. It was a symbol of her freedom, of her choice to stay. A marriage. This kind of marriage would not be a chain. It would be an anchor, holding them together in the storm they both knew was coming. "Yes," she said. "Yes." The wedding was to be in 3 days. Clara rode into town, not with fear, but with purpose. She went to the general store and bought a length of simple white linen. Martha, the woman with the sour face, watched her with narrowed eyes but said nothing. The tide of public opinion, however fickle, had begun to turn. She took the linen to Ruth's small house at the edge of town. The widow welcomed her with a warm embrace. "I heard what the sheriff said," Ruth murmured, her eyes shining with pride. "I knew there was steel in you, child." Together, they made the dress. As their needles worked, a comfortable intimacy grew between them. Clara found herself talking, sharing small pieces of her past she had never spoken aloud. She did not speak of the worst of it, but she spoke of her loneliness, her fear. Ruth listened without judgment, her own stories of hardship and survival a quiet counterpoint to Clara's. It was in these moments, with the scent of chamomile tea in the air and the soft rasp of thread pulling through linen, that Clara truly understood the strength of women, the quiet, resilient bond that could be forged in the face of a harsh world. The dress was simple, with a modest neckline and long sleeves. It was not the gown of a blushing bride, but of a woman who knew her own mind. When she tried it on, Ruth stood back, her eyes misty. "You are not just marrying him, Clara," she said softly. "You are marrying yourself, the strong woman you were always meant to be." The wedding was not held in the town's small, severe church. Instead, they chose a spot in the canyon, a place where a single, ancient cottonwood tree grew beside a seasonal creek. Its leaves, a vibrant green against the red rock, whispered in the afternoon breeze. Only a handful of people attended. Ruth was there, her face beaming. The young homesteader, Thomas, came with his wife Mary, who held their swaddled infant. The blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Gus, stood beside them. The circuit judge, a portly man with a kind face, had been persuaded to make the trip out from the county seat. Eli stood waiting for her under the shade of the great tree. He was dressed in a clean shirt, his face still bruised but his eyes clear and full of a love that took her breath away. He was not healed, but he was whole. As she walked toward him, the simple linen of her dress brushing against the wildflowers that grew by the creek, she felt a profound sense of peace. The judge's words were a low murmur against the sound of the wind. When it was her turn to speak, Clara's voice did not shake. She looked directly into Eli's eyes. "I came to this place with nothing," she said, her words simple, honest, and stripped of all artifice. "You gave me shelter. You gave me safety. But more than that, you gave me back myself. I choose to stand with you. I choose to build with you. I choose to defend our life. Together, with all that I am yours." When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Eli gently took her face in his hands and kissed her. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a seal on a vow that had been made long before this day. That night, back in the cabin, a new, quiet sense of permanence had settled over the small room. Eli lay in the cot, exhausted from the day's effort. Clara sat on the floor beside him, the soft light of a single lamp casting a warm glow on her face. She was still wearing her wedding dress. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers tracing the calloused lines of his palm. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered into the stillness. He smiled, his eyes full of a weary contentment. "You are my wife, Clara. There is no need for thanks between us." "No," she insisted, her voice thick with emotion as she finally gave voice to the deepest truth of her heart. "You do not understand. I am not thanking you for saving me from the fire. I am not thanking you for giving me a home, or even for what you did in the town. I am thanking you for something more." She squeezed his hand, her eyes locking with his. "I am thanking you for seeing me, for looking at me, right from the very first, and not seeing a broken thing, but just a person." A deep emotion moved across his face, a vulnerability he rarely showed. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "You were the one who was easy to see. Clara," he said, his voice rough. "It was me who was hiding. You were the one who saved me back." The peace lasted for 1 week. One perfect, quiet week where they lived as husband and wife, their days falling into a simple, beautiful rhythm of work and companionship. Then Poe returned. He came in the dead of night, not alone, but with a gang of 4 hired men, rough-looking drifters with cold eyes and ready guns. They came not just to reclaim, but to destroy. The first warning was the frantic barking of the dog Eli had acquired, followed by the terrifying sight of torches bobbing in the darkness, moving toward the cabin. "Get the rifle," Eli said, his voice deadly calm as he swung his legs out of bed. grabbing the pistol he now kept beside him. The time for recovery was over. The attack was swift and brutal. Gunshots shattered the single window of the cabin. A torch was thrown onto the roof, and the dry shingles caught fire with a hungry whoosh. They were trapped, just as Clara had been trapped before. But this time, she was not alone. And this time, she would not be helpless. They fought back with a desperate, coordinated fury. Eli took a position by the door, firing methodically at the shadowy figures outside. Clara, her heart pounding but her hands steady, fired the rifle through the broken window, using the skills he had taught her to make every shot count. The cabin was filling with smoke, the heat from the burning roof becoming unbearable. One of Poe's men went down, clutching his leg. Another fell back with a cry. But there were still too many, and the fire was spreading. Through the smoke and chaos, Clara saw Poe, standing back from the fight, his face illuminated by the flames, a look of mad triumph in his eyes. He was not just trying to kill them. He was trying to burn away their existence, to erase the home they had built. As one of his men fell, Poe seemed to realize the fight was turning. He began to back away, moving toward the horses they had tied at the edge of the clearing, ready to make his escape and leave his hired guns to their fate. In that instant, a cold, clear purpose settled over Clara. This would not end until she ended it. She could not let him get away, to return another day, to forever haunt their lives. "I am going out," she said to Eli, her voice tight. "No, Clara, it is too dangerous." But she was already moving. Keeping low, she slipped out the back of the cabin, where a small storage lean-to offered some cover. The air was thick with gunpowder and the smell of burning pine. She crept around the side of the house, staying in the shadows, her eyes fixed on Poe as he untied his horse. Their own horses, spooked by the fire and gunfire, were rearing and pulling at their tethers nearby, with a speed she did not know she possessed. She ran to Boulder, Eli's steady gelding. She untied the reins, vaulted onto his bare back, and kicked him into a gallop, circling around the clearing to cut off Poe's escape. Poe heard her coming. He scrambled into his saddle, fumbling for his gun, but he was too slow. She rode him down, her horse blocking his path in a dry wash at the edge of the canyon. She had picked up Eli's pistol from where he'd dropped it in the chaos, and now she leveled it at Poe's chest. He stared at her, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He was trapped, held at bay by the very woman he had sought to dominate. His shock quickly curdled into his familiar, sneering hatred. "So, the little whore has claws after all," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You can shoot me, but it will not change what you are. You will always be filth, something men use and throw away." Clara looked down at him from the back of the horse. The fire from their burning home raged behind her, casting her in a flickering, demonic light. The heat of it was on her back, but the fire inside her burned hotter. She felt no fear. She felt no shame. She only felt the cold, hard truth of her own survival. "No, Mr. Poe," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying with it the weight of every scar he had tried to inflict upon her. "I am fire." She saw the flicker of fear in his eyes then. He finally understood that he was not facing a broken girl, but a force of nature he had foolishly unleashed. He expected her to pull the trigger. But she did not. Killing him would be an ending, but it would be his ending, a final act of violence that would bind her to him forever. She wanted something else. She wanted justice. "Get off the horse," she commanded. He hesitated, and she cocked the pistol, the sound clicking sharply in the night. He slid from the saddle, his hands raised. "Drop your gun belt, slowly." He did as he was told. "Now you will walk," she said, her voice like ice. "You will walk back to town. You will walk down the main street with no gun and no horse, like the coward you are. And you will tell Sheriff Coffey what you have done." Humiliation, a fate worse than death for a man like Poe, dawned on his face, but he saw in her eyes that there was no other choice. With a final, impotent curse, He turned and began the long, shameful walk back toward redemption. Clara watched him go, then lowered the gun. As the sounds of sirens and shouting men approached, she knew the sheriff was coming. The fight was over. She had faced her demon, not with his brand of brutal violence, but with her own unyielding strength. And she had won. The fire that had sought to destroy them became, in the end, a crucible. From the ashes of the old cabin, a new life and a new home began to rise. The winter that followed was harsh, but it was a season of labor and shared purpose. With the help of the blacksmith, Gus, and a few other townsfolk who had finally chosen decency over judgment, a new cabin was built. It was smaller than Poe's house had been, but it was solid, built of sturdy pine logs chinked tight against the wind. It was their own. Months passed. The relentless sun of the Arizona Territory softened, its heat becoming a gentle warmth rather than a brutal hammer. The land, which had been a barren expanse of brown and gray, underwent a miraculous transformation. Spring arrived not as a whisper, but as a shout. A carpet of new green grass spread across the plains, and the canyons bloomed with a riot of wildflowers, the fiery orange of poppies, the deep purple of lupine, the delicate white of desert primrose. The air was sweet with the scent of sage and damp earth. The sun rose each morning over a world that felt washed clean, reborn. The changes in the land were mirrored in the life Clara was building. Her reputation in town, once a thing of whispers and scorn, had been forged anew in the fire and the confrontation that followed. She was no longer seen as Poe's damaged property, but as the woman who had stood her ground, the woman who had helped deliver Mary's baby, the woman who had faced down a bully with a steady hand. Respect, she learned, was a harder thing to earn than fear, and infinitely more valuable. This newfound standing gave her an idea, a purpose that reached beyond the boundaries of her own homestead. She had seen the other girls in town, the ones with haunted eyes who reminded her so much of herself, the orphans, the poor relations, the ones who were seen as little more than future wives or unpaid servants. They were taught to cook and to clean, but not to think. They were taught to be silent, but not to have a voice. She started small, inviting 2 young sisters, whose parents had been lost to a fever, to the cabin. With Ruth's help and encouragement, she began to teach them. They would gather on the new porch in the afternoons, the gentle sun warming their shoulders. Clara taught them their letters, scratching the alphabet into the dirt with a stick. She showed them how to read, their hesitant voices slowly gaining confidence as they stumbled through the pages of an old almanac and the few books Eli owned. She taught them to sew, not just to mend, but to create, showing them how to stitch small, colorful patterns onto scraps of cloth. Word spread. Soon, another girl joined them, then 2 more. Her small flock grew to half a dozen. They were a motley group, shy and mistrustful at first, their shoulders habitually slumped as if expecting a blow. Clara was patient. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand perfection. She saw the same fear and shame in their eyes that she had once seen in her own reflection. She spoke to them of the land, of the names of the wildflowers. She told them stories, not just from books, but from her own imagination. She taught them that their hands could not only work, but could also make things of beauty, and that their minds were not just for remembering chores, but for exploring worlds they had never seen. She was giving them the tools she had never had, the tools for a life beyond mere survival. Her days were full, woven into a new and beautiful pattern with Eli's. They worked side by side, a partnership of equals. In the mornings, they would walk the perimeter of their land, checking and mending the fences that kept their small herd of cattle safe. They moved with an easy, practiced rhythm, their hands often brushing, their conversation a comfortable flow of plans for the day and quiet observations. They planted a small garden behind the cabin, turning over the rich soil, pressing seeds into the dark earth. Clara had never planted anything before. The idea that something beautiful and nourishing could grow from a tiny, dormant seed under her care, was a constant source of wonder. And there was laughter. It was a sound that had been absent from both their lives for so long, and it returned at first as a surprise, then as a welcome guest. It would bubble up when one of the calves kicked up its heels in a comical dance, or when Eli, attempting to fix a leak in the roof, ended up with more tar on himself than on the shingles. The sound of his deep, rumbling laugh was, to Clara, the most beautiful music in the world. It eased the hard lines around his eyes and made him look younger, chasing away the ghosts of his past, if only for a moment. Eli still bore the scars. The faint white lines on his hands and face from old battles were a permanent map of a hard life. The memory of the war and of the family he had lost would still sometimes settle over him like a shroud, making him quiet and distant. But the moments grew fewer and farther between. He had found a new reason to fight, not against an enemy, but for a future. He had found a place to anchor his restless heart. Clara's love, her resilience, her fierce and gentle spirit, had been a balm to his wounded soul. He had set out to save her, and in the process, he had found his own salvation. She had healed him not by trying to fix his broken pieces, but by creating a space where he could be whole. Often, in the late afternoon, when the work was done and the sun began its slow descent, they would saddle the horses and ride. They would climb the high mesas, the world spreading out below them in a breathtaking panorama of color and shadow. They rode through fields of golden grass that swayed in the evening breeze, the light catching in the dust kicked up by the horses' hooves, turning it into a glittering haze. On these rides, Clara would let her hair, which she now wore in a simple, loose braid, fly free. The wind would catch it, pulling the strands from their bindings, whipping it around her face. She would close her eyes and lift her face to the sky, a feeling of pure, unadulterated freedom washing over her. She was not running from anything anymore. She was simply moving with the world, a part of its wild and beautiful expanse. Eli would watch her, a slow, quiet smile on his face, his heart full. One night, after a long, satisfying day of work, they lay outside on a blanket, their heads pillowed on their saddles. The sky was a vast, deep velvet, strewn with a breathtaking multitude of stars. The Milky Way was a shimmering, silvery river flowing across the heavens. The air was cool and still, the only sound the distant, lonesome cry of a coyote. They lay for a long time in a comfortable silence, holding hands, their fingers laced together. Clara turned her head to look at him. In the faint starlight, his profile was strong and peaceful. The bruises were long gone, but the memory of that day, of the choice she had made, was never far. "Eli?" she whispered into the great, quiet darkness. "I am here," he answered softly. She hesitated, gathering the courage to ask the question that had been a tiny, lingering shadow in the back of her mind. "When you look at me," she began, her voice small, "do you still see her, the broken girl you pulled from the fire?" He was silent for a long moment, not because he was searching for an answer, but as if he were letting the question settle. He turned his head on his saddle to face her. The starlight was reflected in his eyes, making them gleam. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of profound tenderness. A gentle smile touched his lips. "No, Clara," he said, his voice a low, certain rumble that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. "When I look at you, I only see the woman who saved me back." The words were a release, the final, quiet click of a lock that had been sealed for a lifetime. Her heart felt so full it might burst. She squeezed his hand, and no more words were needed. The next morning, Clara woke to the first rays of sun slanting through the window, painting golden stripes across the wooden floor. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Eli, and walked to the small mirror that hung by the door. For years, she had avoided her own reflection. She had seen only a stranger with haunted eyes, a face that held the imprint of every cruelty, every shame. But now, she truly looked. The woman who stared back at her was not a girl anymore. Her face was leaner than it had been, tanned by the sun, with fine lines beginning to form around her eyes from squinting into the bright light. But her eyes were clear. They were not the eyes of a victim, but of a survivor. They held the memory of pain, yes, but they also held the light of strength, the warmth of passion, and the fierce glint of courage. She saw the woman who could calm a birthing mother, who could teach a child to read, who could stand her ground in a dusty street, who could build a home from ashes. She saw a woman who was loved, and who loved in return. Slowly, deliberately. She reached for her dress, a simple blue garment she had made herself. She buttoned it, her fingers no longer trembling with fear, but sure and capable. Each button was an affirmation. She was dressing herself for a new day, a day of her own making. She finished the last button, took one final, long look at the woman in the mirror, and offered her a small, knowing smile. Then she turned, opened the cabin door, and walked outside into the bright, clean light of the morning, no longer whispering her shame to the shadows, but ready to speak her name with pride to the rising sun. Thank you for joining us around the fire for this story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.